All right, so what I'd like to do is kind of just go through my path, how I got to where I am, at least during the early stages of my career. And part of that is going to encompass both my graduate work and my postdoctoral work. So this is kind of lessons for those of you who are looking to get involved about how to get involved, how to get a mentor, what are strategies and behaviors that you should partake if you want to go on in space life and physical sciences. So just in general, the main focus of my lab, actually foci of my lab, are two-part. On the left of your screen, we have sort of the work that I've been performing over the course of my career related to improving human health in spaceflight, and that's specifically prevention of bone loss and fractures that could occur during spaceflight, both actual spaceflight studies as well as simulated ground-based studies. And then I have another component of my research team in which we are aimed at preventing radiation-induced bone fractures in our cancer survivors. So we see them at pretty high rates, which is really cool because it allows our lab to be pretty dynamic in terms of what we're doing. It keeps us busy, but we perform a lot of spaceflight studies, do a lot of cancer-related work, and I think it keeps it overall pretty interesting. But the one thing that's been consistent throughout my career, and actually what got the entire radiation-induced bone loss section of my work started, is this career loss pursuit and trying to test ways to prevent damage to skeletal health during spaceflight. And so we perform ground and flight studies to do so. We've been doing it throughout my career. Here's a couple of our mission patches for studies that we've been involved in. There's me standing in front of the shuttle after it returned from its last mission. And there you can see myself and soon to be doctors Charayu Patel and Caitlin Reno for one of our last spaceflight missions. So let's talk a little bit about how I got here and maybe provide some advice. So for me, it all started back in 1995 when I decided to enter a program in physical therapy. Back then, you could get a degree in physical therapy. You didn't need a doctoral degree or anything like that. And afterwards, I started doing paleontology-related research. It was functional anatomy, and I got my master's work in that. And so with that, what we were studying, and on my right, I have my mentors, Adriana McNevicius and Stephen Riley. We were studying about how all of these different animals' bones, their forms, represented the function of their bones, right? It's sort of the study of evolution of posture is what we were really interested in. And I went to Clemson University initially to study that as my doctoral work. But there was a man down the hall who was launching mice into space as a means to try to prevent bone loss that occurs during microgravity. And as I went through sort of my doctoral work, I really wanted to make sure that the work I was doing had more direct applications to human health. Now, trust me, I still really think it was cool to do the evolution work as well as the paleontology, but I decided I wanted to switch to bioengineering and start my training, my doctoral work, performing space life sciences related research. So my advisor was a man named Dr. Ted Bateman at Clemson University in the Department of Bioengineering. Here's Ted right here showing me some trabecular bone next to our micro CT scanner. All of this work was supported by the National Space Biomedical Research Institute, or NSBRI, who throughout my career have supported my graduate work. They supported my postdoctoral work. As a faculty member, they gave me a career award, and they sort of transitioned into what's been now called the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, or TRISH, and they've been supporting me throughout my entire career. So a little bit about my mentor. Ted Bateman, PhD, got his PhD from Colorado State. He was a Bioserv alum. Bioserv Space Technologies is a group out of UC Boulder. He was heavily involved in ASGSB, which was the predecessor to ASGSR, and wanted us as students to get heavily involved in that. He also was as an instructor and very much involved in the Space Life Science Training Program. And so again, he really, really wanted us as students to get involved into this spaceflight related education and training. And he had performed multiple launches of rodents into space. I believe his group was the first to ever launch mice into space aboard the space shuttle. And so to me, that was very appealing because I could study bone form and function and do it in what I thought was a really interesting manner. As I mentioned, he really highly valued mentoring and training, which actually is something that I do to this day in part because of Ted, because he provided us with these incredible opportunities. These opportunities to go down to the Kennedy Space Center, go to Loma Linda University, go to Brookhaven, go all over the country, perform NASA studies. And so many of us are still engaged with NASA. In fact, if you look at some of these pictures right here, like right here, there are a number of individuals who still do perform NASA-related studies. For those of you who know Ramona Bober and a couple of other individuals in this is, let me try to remove this right here. Andrea Hansen works in the Artemis program. And so they really motivated us to continue this work in space life sciences. Now, Ted's lab is focused primarily on bone loss that occurs in microgravity in astronauts. But he wanted to start asking additional questions like, could spaceflight radiation cause bone loss, which had not been studied to that point in time. And the reason why was because people generally thought bone wasn't affected by radiation. So what I want to start off by highlighting is the kind of things that Ted had us do as graduate students to answer some of these questions, but train us to be space life scientists as well. So back in 2005, we wanted to perform the very first study that examined the effects of proton radiation on bones. Protons are ejected from the sun during, say, solar flares, and we didn't know if they could affect bones at all because no one had studied that yet. So this is the acronym. NASA loves acronyms, so he called it the Clemson @01 study. But he wanted us to do it off-site, not at Clemson. So he sent us down to the Kennedy Space Center because he wanted us to learn a few things. One, how to run an off-site study, and how to prep for a launch. It takes a lot of work to run an off-site study. I believe Dr. Coulomb talked about that for the MHU-8 mission a couple weeks ago. But when you're running an off-site study, you have to bring everything with you, and there's a lot to learn. He wanted us to learn how to network and to meet people, and there are definitely strategies for networking that you can pick up when you're off-site at, say, the Kennedy Space Center, which I think is very important. He also really wanted us to learn that when you're off-site and you have limited resources, you want to be prepared, but stay calm and solve problems. And I'm highlighting this because I'm going to come back to this here in a couple slides. All right, so I'm going to give you some what was told to me, actual advice that was given to me at a poster session back in 2004 by an individual reading my work examining radiation effects on bone. And this expert in radiation biology told me, hey, radiation does not cause bone loss. You're wasting your time. Your project is worse than a fishing expedition. Actually, the person then said, because a fishing expedition assumes that there's actually fish. So this was the kind of advice I was given as a graduate student going into a brand new field that was related to spaceflight by someone who just thought it was nonsense. Well, what we showed them, and really the actual specifics of the science don't matter, but other than to say, you know, in terms of the figures and the images, we showed radiation does cause bone loss, even at low doses relative to spaceflight. First time that was shown. Osteoclasts, the cells that break down bone, are increased in their activity and cause rapid bone loss after radiation. If we use an osteoporosis medication, we can actually prevent that bone loss that occurs after exposure to radiation. And to sum it all up, say almost 20 years later, we just performed a prospective clinical trial here at Wake Forest in which we gave osteoporosis medications to our patients receiving radiation therapy for lung cancer, what's called radiosurgery, to see if we could prevent the bone loss that occurs and ultimately the fractures. So this is a prospective clinical trial that we performed years after starting it, being supported by NASA. So I would ask you as trainees and individuals learning to sort of advance, especially knowing that you can do NASA-related work that then translates to the clinic, what's the lesson here in terms of what I was told as a student by an expert? And then ultimately, can NASA-related work be translated into clinical applications? All right, so back to this right here. So again, highlighting the fact that we need to stay calm and solve problems as well as be prepared. And in terms of staying calm and solving problems, I want to give you two examples related to some of our spaceflight studies in which that really came in handy quite a bit. All right, so the Rodent Research 9 mission was a mission that started was funded in 2014. I was a PI in this mission. If I go back, it was myself, Mike Delp, who was at Florida State, and Vivian Mao, who was at Loma Linda University. Now, what we were looking at specifically is during spaceflight, was there any articular cartilage or joint damage? So if you think about joints, I'm talking about the knee joint and the hip joint. were there damage to those soft tissues that occur? And were there performance deficits that occurred post-flight that we could measure relative to pre-flight? Because we know that astronauts have a lot of problems with balance and performance when they get back from space. And we wanted to identify if it was damage to the skeletal system that caused that damage in performance. And so 3 years after the study was funded, we went down to the Kennedy Space Center. Here's the several members of my team standing outside of SpaceX headquarters. Here's the VAB, which I'm sure probably some of you have seen before. It's a very, very large building in which they assemble the spaceflight vehicles. But we ran into some unexpected challenges. You see, normally what we do when we measure gait or performance, gait is how an animal's limbs are moving in time and space. What we do is we put these animals inside this box here on top of this. This is called the digigate. And we measure how their limbs are moving. Now, when we did our pre-flight sort of definition phase studies, in other words, we're telling NASA, yes, we can do what we propose to do. We use mice from Charles River, which is a vendor. When we actually got down to the Kennedy Space Center, we used mice from a different vendor from Jackson Labs, and they did not behave in the same manner, which was problematic because it took 7 minutes per mouse to get data, which is unacceptable. When we get animals back from space, we want to test them immediately so that we can put them into a dissection flow so we can test to see if spaceflight affects certain tissues that doesn't involve a readaptation to gravity. And over here, I have Sung-Sin Choi, who was managing the project from NASA, and she was not pleased that it was taking 7 minutes per mouse. Well, remember, be prepared, stay calm, solve problems when you're doing these kinds of studies. But this also goes to hiring good people. Why we hire good people who we trust, particularly students. And so I had 3 individuals right here. Eric Livingston, who's done dozens of space flights with me. We went to grad school together. Joseph Moore, who is my lab manager and an amazing engineer. They're both sort of engineers. And Andy Kwok, who is the lead PhD student. Now, all of these individuals recognize, well, maybe we're going to be able to make some modifications. And Joseph, being prepared, brought our entire shop down from Wake Forest to the Kennedy Space Center. So we go to Ace Hardware, where overnight, everyone calmly made some modifications to this box where the animals are, created this housing unit right here, which allowed the animals to enter and exit very rapidly. And so it only took us about a minute and a half per mouse to get data. So Sung-Shin was very, very, very happy. But along those lines, a couple other good things came of this. One, we ended up submitting this new technology as a grant to NASA, which got funded so we could do further testing. And then Andy Kwok, again, the lead student on here, published a paper on the technology and the data and won COSPAR, it's another spaceflight related organization's Outstanding Paper Award. So one of the highest awards they give to students. So again, it just goes to show when you're doing spaceflight related studies, you really have to be prepared, stay calm, and keep going. So getting back to some of the work that we did during the course of my graduate training, in 2007, we performed my first spaceflight experiment, which was on STS-118, that was the Space Shuttle Endeavour, in which we were testing a drug trying to prevent muscle loss during spaceflight. It was managed by Amgen and Bioserve, and here were the PIs of the study, the primary scientists. And here's just a couple images. There's Ted right there doing some science, and our group in front of the VAB, me looking up. And what we learned was this. What I took away from it is this, is that these rodent studies are absolutely massive undertakings, but I absolutely loved it. I love the fact that we could interact with all of these scientists from around the country and all of these individuals with different backgrounds that were part of different companies, different locations, had different skills, all of us working together towards a common goal. And for me, I was absolutely hooked at that moment. I absolutely loved performing spaceflight related studies, and I knew I wanted to continue doing something in the spaceflight orbit, if you will, right? I loved planning off-site missions. There is a lot that goes into it, and there's some strategies. I loved project management, networking, meeting great teammates and other scientists, and watching launches. Let's admit it. When you go down to the Kennedy Space Center, or wherever you are and you're performing science that goes into orbit, watching those launches really makes it worth it because there's a lot that goes into it, as Jen Coulomb could probably tell you. So at this point, I was graduating with my PhD and I had some decisions to make, a lot to consider. Do I go into industry or do I go into academics? Now, I had some opportunities to go into industry. Academics to me seemed like, all right, this is the challenge that I want in my life because I wanted to also work with students and help them make and meet their goals. And I knew that the best way I could do that in this arena would be to go into academics. So the next step was, how exactly do I go about doing that? Because at that point, I knew that I needed to do a postdoctoral fellowship, but I did not want to do a postdoctoral fellowship outside of the spaceflight area. And there was a postdoctoral fellowship sponsored by the National Space Biomedical Research Institute. You essentially wrote a grant and you applied for this. The NSBRI, similar to what's called TRISH now, is a biomedical research institute that's interested in improving human health in space, funding novel, unique, innovative research approaches. And to me, that really was aligned with what I wanted to do. You know, my original degree was in physical therapy. So I really wanted the work I do to have an impact on human health. And I thought this would be a great opportunity. I got a mentor from the Kennedy Space Center who had worked with TRISH previously. Ted Bateman, my advisor, had a grant through, or not TRISH, NSBRI. And so we wrote the grant and it was funded. What was amazing to me was that the chief scientist of NSBRI at the time, David Watson, reached out to me and said, hey, you know, I'm really interested in your work. And I was a little timid at the time talking to him because he was the chief scientist of an organization. And I was just a new graduate, postdoc right out of graduate school. But he maintained that conversation with me. And we developed a relationship in which he sort of took me under my wing. He was very interested in the science I wanted to pursue. And that was a little different than the work that I had performed during my graduate work. Instead of looking at if spaceflight can damage bony tissues, I was interested if it could damage some of the joint soft tissues, maybe cause arthritis. So some of these tissues include the menisci, which are wedges that we see between the knees, the ACL, anterior cruciate ligament, the posterior cruciate ligament, etc. And so I wanted to see if arthritis could form in the spaceflight environment. So David really supported that. He wanted to have weekly meetings with me to sort of check progress, see how we were doing, support the work. He introduced me to many different individuals that were performing spaceflight related research, which really helped out my career. And I'm very appreciative to David for all the work that he did. But towards the end of my fellowship, he helped me identify that I really needed to become a true arthritis researcher if I wanted to carry on in this field and do it in the spaceflight realm. So, working with me, we identified a fellowship in translational radiation oncology at Wake Forest School of Medicine that would allow me to work with a radiation biologist, Dr. Mike Robbins, and an arthritis doctor, Dr. Richard Lozer. He's now the director of the Arthritis Center at UNC Chapel Hill. And if I worked with these individuals, then I would gain the skills needed to be an actual arthritis researcher with the goal, working with David, to get our work up on the space shuttle at the time. It was also during that time that David introduced me to the biospecimen sharing program from NASA Ames, which at the time you would apply, and if they approved your application, then if there was a space flight experiment, you could go down to the Kennedy Space Center and get some tissues. So he encouraged me to do that. We wrote up the application. It was approved, which led to the STS-135 mission, which was the very last shuttle mission. The Space Shuttle Atlantis occurred back in 2011, in which they were testing an antibody to protect against bone loss. Here are some of the PIs of that particular mission. Ted Bateman was one, Mary Bucksine, and then the group from Bioserve. I played dual roles in that mission. I was a dissector of all the bones, but I also had my biospecimen sharing program mission. So it was really great experience. I met a lot of great individuals. This room is packed with scientists and engineers from around the country. And I got to know them over the course of the weeks that I spent down at the Kennedy Space Center. And again, you can see that there's these large dissection teams. And I met a great collaborator, Dr. Mary Bucksine, with whom I still work. And in fact, last year, myself, Chirayu Patel, Anna, Jen, a number of us that are on this call right now all worked together with Dr. Mary Buckstein, who is the PI, in collaboration with the Japanese Space Agency to perform a spaceflight experiment. So to me, it's been incredible, right? You get to do these spaceflight experiments, and while you're doing it, you can meet all these incredible individuals who are providing you with guidance and advice about not only how to succeed as a scientist at the time, but what I learned is that most individuals, when you start collaborating with them, when you start interacting with them, are going to want to help you advance. Your success, they take a personal investment in your success. And I see it again and again and again. And so after that STS-135 mission, I had some decisions to make, right? One, I was offered a position as a chief scientist at a company in the spaceflight industry. Or two, I was offered a position as an assistant professor in radiation oncology at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. So that was my first real decision. There's so many things I had to weigh to try to make that particular decision. And so that left a number of questions that I had to consider. But before we get into that, and actually we may not get into that at the time, but I just want to, mention this. When you are in the training phase of your career, there are a number of behaviors that you really should apply if you want to succeed in the field of space life and physical sciences. And actually, this probably applies to everybody. In fact, if you want to go to medical school, or if you're a professional, I would argue that for me, the most important behavior for me is to continually get mentors, to maintain the mentors I have, but continue to get more mentors. Because we are not fully prepared for the next step ever. No one ever fully trains us for what we need to do. It's always good to get advice from an individual who wants you to succeed simply because they want you to succeed, not because they have a personal investment in whether or not you succeed, other than to just see you succeed. So to be able to get advice is really important at every step of your career. But if you are a mentee, say you're a graduate student looking to go to get a postdoc, or if you're just in the middle of your graduate career, you really need to get a mentor who pushes and supports you. Support is the key. And I know it's easy to say that you need to get a mentor, but there's a lot to it, right? There's strategies to get a mentor. How do you approach an individual? Who should you talk to? At what level should you talk to them? The next behavior I would argue is be enthusiastic and let it be known, right? Always be enthusiastic about what you're doing. And for those of you who are interested in doing spaceflight related work, it's not hard. Doing this kind of work is incredible. I'm going to be honest here. There's a lot of times where there are some fantastic scientists at the institutions in which I work who are not having their work really highlighted by their institutions relative to us, who I think are doing excellent science as well. But if you're doing spaceflight related work, people just want to hear about it. It's something to be enthusiastic and excited about. But the two I really want to point about is this: get active and involved. At every stage of your career, whether you're a postdoc, whether you're a graduate student, whether you are an early stage PI, you need to get involved. You need to become engaged, right? Take all the opportunities that are presented to you and make the most of it. At the end of this, I'll talk about how I think Chirayu and Caitlin, my students, are absolutely doing this, and they are going to succeed because of that behavior. But that's what I try to teach them to do, right? And of course, they take the initiative on their own, but I've took many opportunities. Here's myself working with Dr. Charlie Bolden, who was the administrator at NASA, as well as a couple other individuals with whom we work. Some of them worked at SpaceX, as well as the Navy, performing congressional technology demonstrations, as well as advocacy with both at the U.S. Congress, with both NSBRI and ASGSR. These kind of opportunities introduce you to individuals who will then take a personal investment in your success and will help you succeed. Also, we have a very small field, so any way in which you can get involved, get engaged, and get known. Because involvement promotes your reputation. Gaining a national reputation early in your career is relatively easy if you're doing spaceflight-related sciences, as opposed to, say, cancer, because if you're performing cancer-related studies, the field's gigantic. We have a relatively small field, so get involved. get involved in the societies, get involved in leadership within the societies, talk to your advisor, ask them how you can get involved. Take these opportunities because it will help you succeed ultimately. And before I get to that last point, I will say it is a feedback loop. The more that you are involved, the more people you will meet, and they will provide you with more opportunities. When I was a graduate student and then as a postdoc, here are just a few of the activities I took in. For the Radiation Research Society, I was involved in their Scholars and Training Committee and ultimately became the chair of that committee, which got me to introduce me to many individuals within the society, many of whom I still talk to today, lots of whom. I was heavily involved in ASBMR and the society. NSBRI. NSBRI allowed me to go to the NASA Space Radiation Lab at Brookhaven, to Georgetown University, to the Kennedy Space Center, out to Loma Linda, and to meet many of the people with whom I still collaborate, right? Certainly being part of multiple spaceflight studies helped get to know people. But as I mentioned, every time you make a connection, it leads to more opportunities. And those opportunities lead to more opportunities. And so all of these groups, institutions, universities represent places that have people working with whom I met during my training. We still maintain those relationships today. I'm very excited to say many of us have collaborated for years, decades. Myself, Mike Picot, we've probably performed 5 spaceflight studies together. He's going to be the incoming president of ASGSR, I think after this year. Ted Bateman, and this was, by the way, was the Rodent Research 9 mission. This was my team. I invited my old advisor to come join our team. Mike Delp from Loma Linda, Vivian Mao, or excuse me, from Florida State, Vivian Mao. We've performed many different experiments together, both ground and flight studies. And then, of course, my people. And so the point here is that as you make connections, maintain those connections, those people can even become your mentors, and they will vouch for you. They'll provide you recommendations, and they will help you succeed and advance in your career. And I also just like to highlight the fact that I really think that my students are doing a remarkable job carrying on that tradition of getting involved, right? So Chirayu Patel was the student lead for our Rodent Research 18 mission. I was actually the PI for that mission was Vivian Mao. Here's Sung Shin again, who was managing that particular mission. Mike Delp is right here. Picot's in here someplace, I think right there. But Chirayu did a fantastic job getting to know and interacting with many of these particular individuals. So they know who he is and they trust him. They've invited him to do some work with him. Then Caitlin Reno and Chirayu Patel, my graduate students, also were leaders as part of the MHU-8 mission. The PI for my team was Mary Bucksine. There were a number of other PIs, including JAXA, or Japanese Space Agency PIs. It was an incredible mission. And so they did a great job, not only doing their work, but getting to know individuals. And one of the last things I just want to highlight is that their work really represents the kind of involvement that can lead to success during your graduate training. I mean, if you take a look at what they've done, they've gotten involved in ground-based studies. Here's all of us at Brookhaven National Lab, the NASA Space Radiation Lab, in collaboration with LSU and Arkansas. At Brookhaven, we see Caitlin leading some of our off-site efforts, performing rodent-related research. Chirayu and Caitlin have given many presentations that have been very effective, mentoring students from Winston-Salem State. Chirayu, for the past 2 years, from a student from the College of New Jersey, Sabrina, who I believe is on the call, and Leslie from Virginia, mentored students who award the top prize for a summer RU program. Certainly, these individuals have learned to interact and form great teams, effective teams, and also work with companies like Leidos. And then Chirayu is now performing advocacy as part of ASGSR. And I would argue that these kinds of behaviors, saying yes to everything, getting to know individuals, collaborating, being a great teammate, showing enthusiasm, are really the drivers of success if you want to get into space life and physical sciences. The very last thing I want to mention is this. Networking, I've just said it a whole bunch of times. Networking, collaborating, getting to know people, having them become your mentors. It is difficult for some individuals to network. I get that, because oftentimes we have to step outside of ourselves. it's difficult for some individuals to go up to somebody and just say, hey, I'm interested in you becoming a mentor, or I would like to come talk to you if you're at a conference. Sometimes we may be intimidated to go up and meet people. One of the greatest things about ASGSR and a lot of the spaceflight related groups is that people are very friendly. But I understand it's difficult to talk to them. Sometimes it's difficult to talk to professors in your department or at your institution, or reaching out to and talking to individuals at companies with whom you might want to work. But I'll tell you something. I learned something very important, and this comes from Andrea Hansen. Andrea was like my academic sister. Her advisor was a woman named Virginia Ferguson, who was at Colorado. And her and my advisor were best friends. So we did everything together, all these spaceflight studies. And we were on an elevator in probably 2006 at the Human Research Program meeting. And I wanted to talk with this scientist who's a really well-known scientist, but I didn't know how to start the conversation, because I really wanted that person to learn about what we were doing and then maybe see if there's a way that we could get involved together. But I was kind of in the vapor lock, right? I didn't know what to say. I was a little bit, intimidated at the time. And I still am. I still have to step outside of myself sometimes, as odd as it may seem, talking. But Andrea comes on the elevator and just goes straight up to him and says, "Hi, my name is Andrea Hansen. I am a big fan of your research. I've read all of your papers. I just wanted to introduce myself and say hi." They started a conversation immediately, because people, when you're interested in an individual and just simply say, "Hi, I'm just really interested in your work, and I just wanted to introduce myself," people are very interested in talking to you, learning about you. And once they do that, they start that conversation, then after a while, it will foster an individual who takes a personal investment in your success. So I learned a lot from that. And I carry that behavior with me today. It helps me get mentors. It helps me meet individuals. And I'm very honest. I really am interested in the kind of work that they're trying to do. So I think with that, for the sake of time and answering questions, I'm going to end. For those of you who are postdocs, who are interested in becoming an assistant professor and want to know about the reality of it, is that we're trained to be scientists and engineers. We're trained to write about science and parts of grants. We're really not trained for this job, right? We're basically managing a small business. And so if there's ever a time that you're a postdoc and you're wondering about transitioning, and you're interested in having to learn how to negotiate, and you're interested in about what it really takes to be a PI, what we really do as a job that may have been hidden from you as you're being trained as a scientist or an engineer, I'm happy to talk with you then. But for now, I would be glad to answer any questions that you may have regarding getting a mentor, success, behavior for success, especially if you want to stay in the space life and physical sciences. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you for that, Jeff. That was incredibly insightful. Folks, you can drop questions in the chat if you'd like, or you can raise your hand and unmute and ask. I have one that I've been dying to ask you for a while. I think your background and your sort of winding path in terms of paleontology and like alligator research is so interesting. How do you view that as shaping your current perspectives on your research nowadays? Like, what lessons from your alligator research have stayed with you?
Okay, so I love the fact that I started training doing paleontology related research, because it gives me a totally different perspective than a lot of individuals. I'll tell you why. One, if you do paleontology work, just in general, you have to be really grounded in statistics. And so you have to have, and it becomes skeptical, right? So you have to have a strong background in statistics. And so I always see things through a statistical lens. But because it's really difficult in paleontology to quote unquote prove anything, I know with the scientific method, we don't ever really prove anything, but you become extremely skeptical, right? And that's actually a good thing, because it means that I'm always questioning what we're doing. All the truths that we have that I believe, all right, well, radiation does this. Every so often I question, is that really right? Right? Let's revisit that. Second of all, it also allows me to take things into sort of an evolutionary perspective. I guess what I'm trying to say with that is that, again, I think everything that we believe is fluid. It changes. Like, or our truths are fluid. And it really helps me as a scientist. It allows me to, if we get a finding, publish it. And then if we do it again and we don't necessarily see the same finding, that's okay, because that's a component of the design. That might be a component of the model, but let's still publish it. We have to publish our findings. So I guess the perspective for me is that from evolutionary biology and from paleontology, I think more than most, I have the ability to constantly revisit what we're doing to see if we're going down the quote unquote right path. Oh, and I also love it. I love I love taking time out of my day to see, if somebody down the hall is doing something totally different and totally unique, I absolutely love it. I will go to a talk which is completely outside of my field, and I think that's a component of the evolution part.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess sort of thinking for the future, what areas of research do you envision being, the next big thing for space life sciences?
Oh, yes, the next big thing. All right, well, it's hard to answer that question. I think artificial intelligence, I think just across fields is going to be huge. I think that if you have the ability to perform AI related research, I think that's going to revolutionize spaceflight related sciences, because I think what it'll allow us to do is take these, we're doing these multi-omics data sets, but we have sort of biases. All right, so for instance, we think that maybe this protein goes up or this protein goes down. So we might ignore other patterns. But with artificial intelligence, you can take these huge data sets and then it can identify patterns of change that are important to human health and effects of spaceflight that we may not have even thought of. So it eliminates some of those biases. And I think that that's going to really revolutionize spaceflight research.
Absolutely. We have some questions from our audience. Jasmine?
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. It was wonderful. I was just wondering, so you mentioned maintaining relationships with people. So I was just wondering how to maintain those connections with people that you've either worked with or met at conferences and such, if you're not actively like in communication with them, or you're not like talking to them fairly often.
Okay, so I make it a personal point to reach out to everyone at least a few times a year. I actually just had a person who, I won't say her name, who works for NASA, is a leader at NASA. And every so often I'll just drop a line saying, hey, how's it going? And so for me, I highly value maintaining the relationships through just random communication, reaching out, phone calls, text messages, emails. Now I'm very, very big on personal communication versus just text messages or emails. Picking up the phone is a great way to call and say hi to somebody. I know a lot of people don't like to do that, but I do. If you can go knock on the door of a collaborator at your particular institution, that's great. If I'm ever traveling and I know I'm going through an area in which there's somebody that I have worked with, I'll let them know in advance, and then I'll go see them and say hi. But I do maintain connections with individuals. I do not let it slip, because I want to make sure, well, one, I'm just interested in how they're doing, but and that's just my personality, but I make that a priority.
Great. So you found that even just like a simple, how are you doing? What's new is kind of enough to keep up that relationship?
I probably have about, if you were to look through my text messages, hey, how's it going? What's new? Those particular I probably have thousands of those to hundreds of individuals that I send out all the time. And again, I honestly want to know how they're doing. I want to maintain our relationships with these individuals. And then you'd be amazed at how many of these individuals call me up and they say, hey, I'm thinking about writing a grant. Would you like to be involved? I'm not doing it because I'm being disingenuous, but it does maintain this professional relationship while maintaining a personal relationship.
Great. Thank you so much.
Tao?
Yes, thank you so much for the great talk. So, funny enough, I'm also doing some AI research in radiology. That's where I am in NIH right now. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the multi-omics, that research that you were discussing earlier for another question.
Okay, so Chirai Patel, who is currently the student chair for ASGSR, is in our lab, and he has, for multiple spaceflight missions, been looking at how joint tissue damage can occur in spaceflight. And based on our Rodent Research 9 flight, we thought that it might be suppression of antioxidants that are leading to, say, maybe mitochondrial dysfunction, and maybe just an increase in oxidative stress with mitochondrial dysfunction, which ultimately are causing some of the damage to the knee joints, right? So that's a bias that we have. But what we can do with AI now is take that whole data set, right? And Chirayu, we were looking at proteins for Rodent Research 9. We're looking at expression levels for his subsequent missions. And we can put those into AI algorithms. We haven't yet, but you could put those into AI algorithms and actually really pick out patterns which are affecting it. And more on top of that, so the gait data, I think artificial intelligence to measure performance deficits are really, really important, right? Because what we can do when we get gait pattern changes, so it measures how the limbs angles, for instance, or timing changes in time and space. And so we can simply measure or identify, well, this particular variable changed. But if you take all of those data and put it into an artificial intelligence algorithm, they can then identify better how some of these gait metrics change with each other and what that represents from other databases in terms of neuromotor or sensor motor deficits. So you see what I'm saying? We can do much more complicated science to not only understand the phenotype of damage, but what's causing it. And that's what excites me.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I totally agree. It sounds like not like AI is replacing researchers or doctors, more like you use AI to do science that you otherwise couldn't do manually.
That's correct. I mean, people still need to make the AI, and so we need to collaborate with AI experts, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, I'm in a great lab at NIH.
All right.
There's radiology AI.
It's
So
very
feel
nice to
free.
meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
We also have a question in the chat from Charles. He's writing, I'm a current medical student and I'm interested in applying to aerospace medicine. I am working on a spaceflight related project, but do you have any other advice on what to do to get more involved? Could you also elaborate on your experience working with MDs, for example, in your arthritis project, and how that differs from PhD/postdoc research?
Okay, so I'm gonna take the second question first and ask to repeat the first question real quick. So because I'm in radiation oncology, I work with a lot of MDs that are in my lab. MDs a lot of times do not have the time to do a 4-year project, right? So whereas PhD students in my lab have several years to perform a project. So part of my job as a mentor is to identify within the limits of a student, their constraints, their time constraints, for instance, how to develop a project, a part of a project that can be initiated and completed within the time that they have in my lab. I take that very seriously. So I sit down with them. So I do that with my residents. I just had Daniel Kaganoff, who is an MD student who's now going to UTMB to do his residency. And he worked with Chirayu Patel, who was his mentor, and took a component of Chirayu's project and analyzed it. So I guess what I'm trying to say is when you're working with MDs, what we want to do is, because again, a lot of times they may not have 2 years to do it. We want to, within the constraints that they can accomplish, get a project they can start and finish in a certain amount of time, right? In terms of the science and capabilities and everything, it's the same as with a PhD. It's just, there's more constraints. And I understand that, being in radiation oncology. What was the first part? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the first question was, any other advice on how to continuously get more involved with spaceflight research?
Okay, so if you're an MD, I highly recommend going to, well, first of all, going to ASGSR as a conference is a great idea, right? For MDs, ASMA, the Aerospace Medical Association, is another fantastic place to go, because if you're going to go get your MD, and if one of your ambitions is maybe to go into space medicine, then you can meet a lot of the individuals that are doing space medicine related work. Okay, so whether it's flight surgeons, astronauts, those kinds of things. You can learn about the programs as well. Other than that, at your institution, I would find out who's doing research, go up to them, introduce yourself if you're not doing research already, and see what the kind of work that you can do. And if you are doing spaceflight related research, I would advise you to find another mentor at your institution and do a different project, right? So really expand your horizons.
Great. And then we have another question from our audience, Geraldine.
Hi. So as you mentioned, so space biology and human research in space is a small field compared to other fields. But yeah, the first time I heard about space biology was 5 years ago, and I was not working at all on this subject. I was working on cardiovascular disease. And I was even told by my advisor at the moment that why you want to go to this field is so small, and it must be only 2 or 3 people working on that. And obviously I didn't listen, and I was surprised to see that this field is actually a big field. I mean, more big than what we think. And I feel that it has gained interest since couple of years, and it's continuing to gain more and more interest. And I was wondering if you can see, in terms of research and funding, more opportunity, or if you expect to have even more opportunity in the field.
Okay, so it's
yeah.
a great question. I wouldn't say necessarily small field, but I mean, relative to like 10,000 people at a conference, it is pretty small. But we all get to know each other, especially those of us that once you start doing spaceflight related studies, even as a student, people know who you are, which you don't see elsewhere. You don't see that in cancer related fields, right? And you have the opportunity at like ASGSR to get involved in the student board and HRP. There's all sorts of organizations with that you can get involved with. And then and then you were asking about the I'm sorry, the second part was the
if you can see yourself more opportunity, like funding, and yeah, than before, yeah.
Well, absolutely. So it's different now. So it's different in that the spaceflight industry, if you will, has been growing. So before, a lot of it was managed by academics, and you'd partner up with groups like Bioserve or a number of other companies, but there weren't that many, right? So you would write grants to NASA, and you would have flight experiments. But then as CASIS/ISS National Labs started growing, and then you see all of these different companies that are popping up, which are developing platforms to do research in space. There are many more opportunities. We have to rethink how we're getting our funding, right? Maybe not necessarily just straight through NASA, but maybe teaming up with a company together with funding from, say, NSF, NASA. And so there are many more opportunities, but we have to adapt to the model. And I think I probably have to do a better job adapting to the model and learning the new model as well. There are more opportunities because of the industry, which is just booming.
Thank you.
Any other questions, folks? Feel free. If not, we can end this here. Thank you so much, Jeff, for coming today, for presenting and sharing your insight with all of us. And thank you to everyone who stopped by and took the times out of their busy day to attend another ASGSR Students webinar. We have our next one happening in May. Time TBD will be announced, so stay tuned for your email announcement for that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone.